Welcome to the Politics Guys interview, conversations about American politics, economics, history, and culture with authors and researchers from across the ideological spectrum. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Greg Lukianoff, attorney, New York Times bestselling author, and president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. He's the author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship, and the End of American Debate, Freedom from Speech, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus. Most recently, he co-authored The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, along with Jonathan Haidt, which we'll be discussing today on the show. Greg Lukianoff, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
You know, I thought we could start maybe with you telling us a little bit about how this book came about and why you and Jonathan Haidt decided to write it.
Well, you know, I always, whenever I ask this question, I always want to ask, like, how real should I be about this? And I think I decided to actually be, very blunt about it. I'd been working in First Amendment law, defending free speech on college campuses since shortly after I graduated from law school in 2001. And I became president of FIRE around 2006. And for my first 2 years of fighting, in these fights and being, isolated from my family in Philadelphia, even though I'd always struggled with depression, I fell into a really terrifyingly bad one that left me, as I talk about in detail, that I've never actually revealed to anyone, let alone my wife or family, of how bad it was in the book. I had that experience of typing sort of like what got me, what got me committed
Yeah.
for a couple of days, with that kind of weird sort of self-deception that this is just between me and you, computer. But I really hit rock bottom. And the thing that helped me out of it, the thing that was why, even though I still get, feel depressions coming on, I can fight them back, is cognitive behavioral therapy. And cognitive behavioral therapy is really kind of amazing. I think you mentioned that you're a Stoic, and I think of it in some ways as applied Stoicism.
Uh-huh.
But even though that the name has somewhat of a bad connotation for people who don't really understand how deep and rich the philosophy actually is, it's not just I have no feelings. It's more talking back to your feelings and interrogating them. And one thing that cognitive behavioral therapy does to make this a practice is it gives you a list of common cognitive distortions that most people engage in, whether that's overgeneralization, labeling, catastrophizing is a very common one, which means exactly like it sounds. I'm big on binary thinking, and I don't mean that this is good, but my wife makes fun of me that I seem to have kind of like, this is going to be great, or it's going to be awful, and she's always like, it could actually be somewhere in between those two, Greg, and I'm like, right. I know that intellectually, just some glitch in my brain seems to think 0 or 1 all the time. And while I was learning these things, and they creep up on you, it was about 9 months into it, and I had many times of being like, because it's a daily practice. You have to do it several times a day. You talk, I give the example of going on a bad date, and it doesn't go well, and you say to yourself, I'm going to die alone. And you write down that thought and how much resonance it has for you. And, if you're really in it, if you're really in anxiety, that could feel like 100% true. And you write that down. But then you ask yourself, like, what kind of cognitive distortion is this? 1, it's catastrophizing. 2, it's mind reading. You don't really know if the person hated you or not. I've definitely had that actually turned out to be good, as far as the other person was concerned, that I thought were terrible. And with time, eventually these voices that we all have in our head to some degree don't have as much sway over you anymore. You can hear them and not take them quite as seriously. So while I was doing this, while I was practicing this twice a day myself, I was watching campus administrators pass policies and react in ways that kind of messaged to students that were in a really dangerous atmosphere. And if someone, we have a famous case in which a professor put up a quote from Firefly the much beloved sci-fi epic that all true nerds really miss.
Oh yeah.
And it's a Joss Whedon show, and it talks about how it's this quote from the captain saying basically, listen, I know you think I'm a pirate and you think I'm going to kill you in your sleep, but you should understand that if that were ever to happen, it would be in a duel. Like we would be facing each other. Like I'm not going to sneak up on you. That's not part of my code, essentially. But because it talks about shooting, he got investigated as a threat to the university, and then he put up a sign saying, no, fascism not allowed here, making fun of the overreaching of a University of Wisconsin satellite. The university pretty implausibly claimed that was advocating for fascism, and he was even a bigger threat to the university. So, and I got used to this kind of modeling of catastrophizing, also in free speech zones, which are still extremely common across the country. Universities pass these policies. Actually, no, they're a lot less common than they used to be fair. But that's partially after a lot of lawsuits. Where, for example, Texas Tech University, 28,000 students, they had only one 20-foot wide gazebo as the only place you could engage in quote-unquote free speech activities. This included handing out newspapers. This included organizing. And, what I see in that is it's sending a message to students that even things as tame as leafletting are fraught with danger and risk, and that essentially free speech is something that should be contained and feared and controlled, even to ridiculous extents. Now, that was most of my career, and at the time, and for most of my career, it was administrators who were overreaching and students who thought it was funny. Thought it was funny or silly, and generally were the most free speech protective people on campus. But I remember thinking at the time, it's like, well, I feel like administrators are modeling this kind of exaggerated, cognitively distorted thinking, but at least students aren't buying it. They all think this is kind of BS. But then sometime around 2013, 2014, I started to notice, seemingly overnight, that you started having students demanding disinvitations for speakers, start demanding new speech codes, start demanding trigger warning policies. At some schools, they wanted them to be mandatory. Those didn't succeed. Microaggression policies, for example. And it's not unheard of for students to advocate for, sort of what might be called enlightened censorship. But it was rare in my experience. But the thing that really made it different was that it was grounded primarily, or oftentimes, in medicalized language. They were arguing that I think this person is regressive, not that I think this person's a bigot. They might have said that I think that also, but that having this person on my campus or having this argument on my campus is traumatic and it's psychologically harmful, usually not to the person who's saying it, but to someone else on campus will be harmed by the presence of this in a real medical way. And, after studying CBT, I became sort of a psychology hobbyist, and I was like, that doesn't sound right. It certainly isn't the kind of advice that a psychiatrist or psychologist who teaches CBT would tell you, that essentially if there's, traumatic or difficult arguments out there or offensive arguments, that you should make sure that you're never exposed to them. That's kind of the opposite of what I thought, someone trying to help someone would really say. So I brought this idea to someone I'd only met one other time, Jonathan Haidt, about how I feel like we're teaching the generation the habits of anxious and depressed people, while at the same time reducing the acceptable area for free speech. And he, to my surprise and delight, because I was already a real fan of his work, particularly the happiness hypothesis, he said, yes, let's write an article together. And we wrote an article about a year later for The Atlantic, also called Coddling of the American Mind, where we talked about the relationship between cognitive behavioral therapy and speech. And our article was successful. We were pretty happy with it. We thought we were all done. But then after we wrote the article in the summer of 2015, things on campus just got a lot more intense. And for the first time ever, within a year or two, I was actually seeing, things like the Milo riots and the Middlebury assault of Professor Stanger, really unprecedented events. And at the same time, we looked up what the mental health outcomes were for students. And we kind of predicted internally that we thought we were going to see, some kind of increase. If we're teaching students the habits of anxious and depressed people, you should expect to see, maybe a bump. And the numbers were much, much worse than we ever would have guessed. So that's what led to the book and led to us doing a lot of research to sort of, refine what we were saying, correct some of what we initially thought, and expand it to say that we're not just teaching a generation the habits of anxious and depressed people. We're teaching a generation the habits of anxious, depressed, and polarized people.
Right. And in fact, you take the whole first part of the book to specifically look at these three, I guess you could call them in the language of CBT, cognitive distortions. In the book, you call them three bad ideas or three untruths. And a lot of what you've been talking about already is what I would characterize as what you call the untruth of fragility. And
right.
Can you maybe more generally say what that untruth is and why it's, mostly wrong?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. So one thing that we tried to repeat, and this is something we found ourselves going down sort of research holes that being much too uninteresting even for readers to want to dive into. And at some point, we wanted to sort of just figure out what are we ultimately trying to say. And we realized that essentially what we were trying to say in the original article was it's as if we are giving a generation of people the worst possible advice as if it was actually good advice. Yeah. And so we kind of built the book around this idea. It's also partially because my family, the way we give advice is we generally make fun of the dumb decision rather than like when my sister Alex is angry about something, I'll be like, you know what you should do with that anger, Alex? You should hold on to it and fixate it for the rest of your life. Yeah. And we find it's actually, it's more effective in some ways to say, I can't tell you exactly what you should do, but I can give you some advice on what you shouldn't. And so the first great untruth that we talk about, and the reason why we call them great untruths, and one of the reasons why I was really so thrilled to write this piece with John, was because he wrote a book called The Happiness Hypothesis, which I already mentioned. But the whole point of that is to talk about what modern psychology has to say about ancient wisdom traditions that have stood the test of time. And he looks a lot at Stoic philosophy, but he also looks a lot at what I know, studied more of myself, Buddhism, and talks about, what research shows is true about each, and finds some real threads in all of these wisdom traditions. So we define a great untruth as being something that both modern psychology does not support, wisdom traditions do not support, and will likely make your life more miserable if you believe in them. So the great untruth of fragility is, and we portray this as a very bad wise man giving the advice: what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Right. And of course, that's a little bit of a play on Nietzsche. I always like to say I'm not actually that huge of a fan of Nietzsche, but the idea that people need challenge to thrive is pervasive. It's one of these things that in almost every wisdom tradition you're going to see some version of the importance of challenge to survive and thrive. And we tie this to Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragility, which is a wonderful book. People should read it. So, it's Taleb, so it can be a little verbose. Yeah. He sometimes needs an editor. And I'm sure, I'm always afraid saying that because the next thing you know, you're in a tweet storm. It's about the idea that essentially we have a word for things that are fragile, of course, and we have words for things that are resistant, whether it's resilient or hardy or whatever. But weirdly, we don't have a word for something that needs stressors, that needs knocks around to get stronger. And this is a little bit ironic if you think about it, because, for example, the human body is anti-fragile. But by that we mean both that if you don't challenge it, that if you challenge it, it can become stronger, it can become healthier. But if you don't challenge it, all sorts of health problems come into existence. Probably the most dramatic version of it is how quickly people's bodies atrophy when they go into space. The astronauts that we've been sending into space for a long time come back with really pretty serious injuries from that. So our premise, and this is something that I really want people to understand, is that people are naturally anti-fragile. And we're doing something really wrong when we convince a naturally anti-fragile human being that they are fragile, because it's, one, not true. People are much more resilient than we often think, or at least sometimes like the most catastrophic thinking supposes. But if you tell them that and they come to believe it, you can actually put them into that position where they haven't had enough experience with stressors, and they have a self-belief, a schema about themselves that they are fragile, where you can be doing them very serious mental and developmental harm, all in the name of foolishly thinking you're somehow helping them.
Right. And so this ties in, well, to a lot of things, but one thing that it certainly ties into is this concept of, it seems to me, microaggressions. And in the book, my sense of things is that you make the argument that microaggressions are often, maybe even most of the time, sort of the result of students being actively encouraged by administrators and other folks to basically interpret what other people are saying and doing in the least generous way possible. Yeah. And so then, right, by extension, the fault is really more in the mind of the person who's considering him or herself the victim than in the person who is supposedly an aggressor. Is that, I mean, am I getting that right?
Yeah, you're getting part of it right.
Okay.
And it's something I always want to be really clear about when I talk about microaggressions. And I don't know how much we expanded on this in the book. And I have to give a little bit of autobiography. My father's a Russian refugee who grew up in Yugoslavia. Okay. My mother is Irish, and she grew up in Britain. My mom has a real emphasis on politeness above all things, because as sort of like a poor Irish girl, so felt like she had to become even more British than the British. And my father comes from the much gruffer tradition of, he will say in his accent, politeness is a form of deception. And I joke my childhood was one big repeated microaggression, because my dad was constantly saying things that would, absolutely horrify my mother and all of her relatives. Unsurprisingly, by the way, they're no longer married. So I actually, at the same time, that gives me a lot of sensitivity to the idea that we do slight each other, we do insult each other, we do say bigoted things, we do engage in racist stereotypes and sexist stereotypes without even realizing what we're doing sometimes. And that makes it a very good subject for academic study. And I really want to stress that, for academic study. Because once you actually make it into a policy, of course, once you make it into a policy at a university, it can take on very strange shapes, including the UC system, where they talk about America as a land of opportunity, America as a melting pot. I think the most qualified person should get the job. They list all of those as microaggressions right off the top, which I don't think was really ever the intention of the people who originated the theory, that we just blanketly call things that people could argue, thinking they're being nice, to be a form of aggression against the oppressed. But as a functional, in function, the thing that concerns us about microaggressions is that, and I actually have to go back to my father. My father would tell me that if you show up in a place and you think that they're going to go by your politeness norms, you're acting like hick. And, of course, in his un-PC way, saying acting like hick means that a lot of times, the people who think they're the most cosmopolitan people in the world, New Yorkers, where I was actually born and lived for about 10 years, they go out and they kind of assume that people are going to conform to their ideas of what politeness is. Whereas genuinely cosmopolitan people who have lived in many different cultures realize you always have to be patient, should give the benefit of the doubt, try to figure out where someone is coming from. Meanwhile, if you fixate on particularly the unintentional slight aspect of microaggressions, of how someone who meant well said something that nonetheless was slighting to me, that's kind of dooming a genuinely pluralistic, diverse community to transforming the kind of misunderstandings that would happen every day under those circumstances into things that actually divide people rather than create an opportunity for people to learn more about each other. When I talk about it, microaggressions are also, in a sense, the cognitive distortion of magnification. That essentially, if you see that someone, who's trying to be kind says a slight, but because they don't know any better, you're giving that an awful lot of power over you if you fixate on it. It's not even good for your own mental health. But
Right.
to be clear, I think there's something very valuable about knowing about microaggressions, but there are some drawbacks as well.
And this obviously ties into the second untruth that you talk about in
Yes.
that first section, that untruth of emotional reasoning, right?
Yes, and that's the one closest to my heart. And the way we explain that one in the form of the worst possible advice is always trust your feelings. And the reason why we liked that formulation was partially because this is the only one of the great untruths that doesn't necessarily sound immediately wrong when who's hearing it. Anybody who has a romantic streak, or anybody who watches sappy movies or sometimes reads self-help books, can have a little bit of there feels like something cold and clinical about saying don't always trust your feelings, and maybe to a degree, to a degree there is, but for me, and I think it's mostly like when people talk about that, they're like follow your heart. They mostly mean like love who you want to love, and there's certainly truth in that, but your feelings are not always the best guide to what you should do. I'm a big believer in Susan David's. She had a perfect phrase for it. I realized I was trying to say what she said in one of her books, and it would take me paragraphs to say this, and she boiled it down to a single line, which is, our emotions are information, not directions.
Yeah.
That the fact you feel jealous, the fact you feel anger, the fact you feel rage, the fact you feel sadness, doesn't mean you have to immediately do the thing that your body is telling you to do in reaction to that, whether it's, take a drink or punch somebody or hide. That a lot of becoming emotionally mature, or if you're someone like me, emotionally, frankly, well, is you have to start talking back to these to try to figure out what they're telling you, what information they're actually giving you. Because sometimes your jealousy might actually just be about your own insecurity, and it's all entirely in your own head. I also like to be clear, also sometimes it's entirely correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I've had to explain this many times, where people are like, you're just saying that people who believe in these ideas, who want social justice, are just crazy. And I'm like, no, I'm saying it's just helpful to go through the process of critically examining it, because you absolutely can come to the conclusion that, actually, you know what, in this case, my instincts were absolutely right. And I think that happens more often than people think. But particularly when you're depressed and anxious, I think it happens less often. So the theory of emotional reasoning, the truth of emotional reasoning, is the one that's most closely tied to the wisdom traditions that teach you to have some amount of distance from your thoughts. I actually kind of like the Buddhist approach a little bit more than the Stoic in some ways, because the ability to kind of see your thoughts as things that are like weather in your brain,
Right.
Although I've never really quite gotten there myself, is somehow more appealing to me than always, challenging it. But at the same time, the Stoic, you read Marcus Aurelius, you read Seneca, or you read Lucretius. Lucretius was a Stoic, right?
Yeah, I think he certainly had Stoic tendencies. Yeah.
Yeah. He's my favorite one to actually read.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, what were you going to say?
No. I was just kind of a digression. Lucretius, I believe, was an Epicurean, but there's still that kind of Hellenistic philosophy type of. There's a lot of tie-in theirs and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, and we talk about Boethius in the book, and about how he created the fictional character of Lady Philosophy,
Right.
who he could, while he was sentenced to death, he could kind of talk himself down by actually having this sort of, moving into your prefrontal cortex and, having the discussion with Lady Philosophy kind of calmed him down about how even his own death could be understood as not the worst of all possible worlds. So that's emotional reasoning. Am I skip anything on that? I got off on a Boethius tangent.
No. I don't. I enjoy these diagrams. That's the nice thing about having a longer format, is we can do that sort of thing.
I do love a good tangent. I did a talk at the Constitution Center with Jeff Rosen, and we got we got into Eastern traditions of whether or not how tolerant you should be of the crazy or harmful thoughts in your head, and whether or not you can actually be a good person and think whatever you want. It was a fun discussion for us. I'm not sure it was the best for an audience who mostly wanted to hear about constitutional law.
Yeah. Actually, it falls off a little bit. I think probably at this point there are some listeners, especially listeners who are further to the left, who are saying, okay, fine. So you're tougher than you think. Toughen up and don't be so emotional. And it's easy for you guys to say this. I mean, both, for instance, you and Jonathan Haidt, you're white males, and I think by most people's standards, they would say that you're privileged elite white males, and
Sure.
and I certainly have enjoyed a lot of advantages from white male privilege as well. And I know that the response from a lot of people of this going to be is that essentially you don't get it. You're not really none of us here are in a position to make this critique because we simply don't understand the experience of being regularly, systemically marginalized and discriminated against and oppressed. And so things that may seem like not a big deal from our privileged standpoint feel entirely differently and come across entirely differently from that other standpoint. I'm sure you've heard that a bunch of times. And so I'm interested in, what your thoughts on that are.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And, one of them is that troubles me is this idea that human beings who don't share the same experiences are essentially unknowable to other human beings. And this comes up in the context of creative writing and cultural appropriation. That can a white writer are they even allowed to write a black character? And this is very troubling to me because I do maybe it's naive, but I do think as human beings there's more than unites us and separates us, and I do think that that empathy and the ability to sense what other people experience isn't given enough credit. I also, as far as the way I've seen, in terms of privilege, undoubtedly a lot of the theory is true. But I think the reason why people bristle at it so much, when they're confronted with it, and then of course that very bristling is saying that you don't get it is the next step in that argument, is it seems to function as part of what I've dubbed the perfect rhetorical fortress. That essentially, on these institutions of higher education, we're spending a lot of cognitive energy figuring out ways that have nothing to do with the substance of someone's argument to not have to listen to them. So, for example, I went to Stanford in the late 90s. I also, I could also plead the fact that I'm a first-generation kid who grew up, qualifying for public assistance. But, I know that if people are really up, and it started working when I was 11, but I know if people are really kind of believers in this, they're not going to hear that.
Right.
That's just, I've already been kind of written off, and that's, I have to be at peace with that. But when it gets used rhetorically, when it gets used essentially to say, I don't have to listen to you because blah, it ends up making substantive arguments extremely difficult. It's sort of the repackaging of the ad hominem. And so the one that we had back when I was in law school was if you could label something conservative, you didn't have to listen to it. And this was something that I, to my shame, and I'm now kind of ashamed of it, I wouldn't read writers who were labeled as conservative, and then finally read Edmund Burke, and I was like, oh, that's actually kind of interesting, and discovered people like Cass Sunstein thought that the idea of traditions actually having some amount of historical validity, if they could actually stand the test of time, wasn't an unsophisticated argument. Even Alan Bloom's book that people were The Closing of the American Mind, which, by the way, our title is not, we actually fought against this title, and we lost. I never liked the title. But then again, since I had this aversion to reading something that had been dubbed conservative, I was like, actually, this is, this concept of nihilism with a happy ending is a kind of deep, interesting idea. It's not, and it gets said almost in the same breath as sort of like Dinesh D'Souza's book or, Tenured Radicals, when it actually brings up some interesting questions that should be considered. I didn't read Thomas Sowell until I was much older, and I was like, wow, actually, that's an argument that you should really have to contend with. So, okay, I was just talking about the first level of protection in the perfect rhetorical fortress. But if you add to it a dimension that essentially all of us participate, because arguably every single one of us have some amount of privilege. Some of us have more, some of us have less. It ends up being applied fairly. It can be applied fairly mechanically, but when it becomes something that essentially is used as an argument tactic to sort of shut down an argument so you don't have to have it. And by the way, frankly, living in the Bay Area in San Francisco for a long time, it was literally years before I ever had an argument about being told to check my privilege
Right.
that wasn't a white person trying to tell me that I should back off.
Yeah.
It was and generally people who came from much more economically privileged backgrounds than I did. And I think that while privilege has a lot of validity to it, if it's seen primarily as a way to shift the topic away from identity of the individual arguer, rather than the argument they're making, it's going to it actually helps. It ends up devaluing the theory itself because people see it more as tactical rather than an essential truth.
Yeah. And this, of course, ties right into the third great untruth, which is that untruth of us versus them.
And that's the one that's one of the ones that I think really it's a point of departure from the original article to the book. A lot of the first two untruths overlap to some degree with what we said in the original article, but one of the many things that John and I have in common is a deep interest in polarization, particularly political polarization, group polarization, tribalism, about how easy it is to make even a group of people who look very much like each other, if you just create certain minimal conditions, you can make them feel less empathy for them and think of them as the other guys. With things as ridiculous as this group is randomly assigned the blue shirts and this group is randomly assigned the red shirts,
right.
And within a couple hours they see the other guys as like, we're all blue shirters here and we have common characteristics. It's amazing how good the human mind is at that. So the great untruth of life is a battle between good people and evil people is something that I also learned a lot about living in different parts of the country and being stuck, by the way, in the culture war. Because since I defend free speech on campus, this means if I'm doing my job right, that means I do get some people who might be more liberal and sympathetic to enlightened censorship on campus. I also take an awful lot of flack from religious people, including I'm a atheist from the northeast of the country who lived in San Francisco
right.
and worked for the ACLU. I'm the devil as far as they're concerned, and I see this and it reminds me that some of these things that we think of as sort of truisms that essentially. The Solzhenitsyn quote, I'm going to butcher it, but essentially the line between good and evil exists in the heart of every man. That essentially, for the most part, we're all, good and evil kind of at the same time. Now, I have been clear before, I do believe in the existence of genuine human evil, and I do believe that there are conditions you can create that cause it. But I am optimistic to believe that most of the time when you're in an argument, you're dealing with someone who thinks they're motivated by good things, believes the arguments that are coming out of their mouth, and believe that their path is actually the one that's more likely to result in the best for most people. But unfortunately, in this polarization, we call it a cycle in the book, but I see it more as a spiral. It seems like we start with the position of what we ignore what we call the principle of charity in the book, which is, of course, giving people the benefit of the doubt, and then things start to sort of spiral out of control as we're already so isolated from people who we disagree with anyway. And what I mean by isolated is if you look at where we live, right down to the city block, right down to individual counties, we increasingly live in places that are more economically isolated, and that was actually some of the scarier data that I looked at. That individual city blocks cluster together both in terms of political identity, but also in terms of wealth or lack of wealth. And that when you add the internet to it, and you add social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook, which essentially reward you for pat you on the back for having a really thick echo chamber, it does have this potential to spiral out of control. And I will say, whether or not Trump was elected in 2016, we would be in a very polarized state right now. Yeah. Of course, I do think, and I make no bones about it, that the fact that Trump was elected has sped everything up. And I think that the cross-partisan animosity is so difficult that arguing about things like benefit of the doubt and trying to have conversations across lines of difference, that work feels not exactly hopeless right now, but to say the least daunting.
Yeah, for sure. But you mentioned the media, and I actually wanted to ask you about that because you just in the book you describe a lot of things that just wow, they're just incredible, real things that happen. But sometimes I wonder if maybe a lot of how we see this situation is a function of the media, both the left and the right wing media, taking essentially a small number of things. And typically they seem to be at these elite schools and just they kind of get blown out of proportion. I think especially I feel like there's this connection between the elite media and elite educational institutions and the sort of, Harvard, Yale, Oberlin are sort of proxies for the entire system. And yet most people are going to schools that are not at all like that. So are we making, what I'm saying? Are we making too much of this or what do you think about that?
I think a lot about that because here's one of the things that's incredibly frustrating for me. I've been defending free speech on college campuses for my entire career. I actually hit 17 years yesterday.
Congratulations.
My 17th year point. And as far as things that just drive me nuts is the bulk of FIRE's cases don't take place at elite colleges, and they don't really have that much to do with politics, left or right politics. And I have a whole chapter in the book where I talk about, where John and I talk about the less sexy motivators for some of the more ridiculous things you see on campus, which is fear of litigation, public relations. A little bit of the customer is always right, but I think that there's an argument that that's probably a lot what's going on there. I just haven't seen something that really indicates to me that's a major motivating factor, but concern about compliance with federal regulation, fear of lawsuits, public relations, those are very powerful for the $70,000 a year colleges, and I'm talking about mid-tier colleges that are now charging that amount, which is just absolutely absolutely scandalous. And most of our cases really don't. So I talk about in the case something that really kind of flips the model on its head about a situation at a college, a University of Northern Michigan, where they were sending scary warning letters to students who had used the psychological services at their college, saying you may not talk about your thoughts of self-harm to any of your friends, or you risk discipline. Now, to me, it's just kind of like, wow, that's nuts. To put it simply, because this is talking about people who might already kind of depressed, and telling them, oh, by the way, two things: you should isolate yourself, and two, you're really a burden on your friends. And there was an administrator at University of Northern Michigan who really said something that sounded very much like you're a burden on your friends. And I'm like, have you ever been around a depressed person? You know how desperately they start to believe those kind of things? So we have a whole section where, like, I'd say probably chapter, I forget what chapter that is now, but it's called the bureaucracy of atheism.
Right.
We probably cover a good 30 different kinds of cases that don't fit the mold there and are more about keeping peace at colleges. And I was horrified at one point when I'll give some background information here. I went to do a op-ed for the New York Times back in 2012, and I was told we had all these horrible examples of outright political censorship, and many of them were against people on the left. And the New York Times basically said, well, you're talking about Christopher Newport universities, but our readers are more interested in elite colleges.
Yeah.
So even though I've spent most of my career fighting these battles at lesser-known colleges, there is a really more intense interest in the cases at where they're more elite. Meanwhile, also in the there are many circumstances I talk about, and I feel like I'm shouting about them. We talk about the case of Lisa Durden. Lisa Durden is a professor at a college in New Jersey, or was a professor. She went on Tucker Carlson to defend a Black Lives Matter party that was limited to black students. That wasn't an official event, and she didn't even attend the party. But she went on because she was like, I'll argue with Tucker Carlson. That's fine. After going on Tucker Carlson, citing fear of the right-wing backlash, they fired Lisa Durden. And I say it with this voice because I'm like, okay, so nobody's paying attention to these cases where we're talking about liberals getting fired, because amazingly, I feel like some of the political correctness like this, the perfect, pristine stereotype of political correctness run amok at a fancy college somehow gets the attention of both the right-wing media and, weirdly, the more prestigious left-wing media at the same time, where there's all of these orphan cases that people aren't paying attention to. But I do want to say, but that doesn't mean that the issues we're talking about when they do look exactly like political correctnness don't matter.
Right.
So we talk about cases like Rebecca Duval's case, in which she wrote an article, a thoughtful academic article, but she said something very risky, which was making parallels between Rachel Dolezal, who was a white woman who decided that she was actually a black woman, and transgenderism, to interrogate the idea of, like, where are our lines about when we can decide what our identity is on any of these spectrums. And that was treated, and I think it's fair to say, pretty much like blasphemy. And she received denunciations from professors all over the country. Hypatia, retracted the article. And the thing that really made it feel much more like a state of, we even talk about Emil Durkheim's definition of witch hunt, because she started also receiving emails from people who had signed denunciations of her saying, "Yeah, I'm really sorry what's happening to you," as if that person was helpless to do anything about the weight of scorn coming down on her. So and these are some of when it comes to the type of sort of nasty kind of groupthinky cases that do get the attention of the media. I have frankly seen more of those in the last 5 years than I have for most of my career, and they are very important. But I do want to be clear: every college has different issues when it comes to freedom of speech, and not all of them look like that.
Sure.
At the commuter colleges, for example, you're not going to see much about microaggressions or trigger warnings, but you might see you're saying, you can't. I mean, probably one of my all-time favorite cases is just so simple. It was at Seminole College down in Florida, where a student wanted to table for PETA, and she was told by an administrator that she couldn't table for PETA. I don't like PETA, and I was like, wow, you didn't even try to come up with an excuse. You were just like, I don't like them. You can't table for them.
Well, so this is a real thing. It's not just happening at the Harvards and the Yales. And certainly, I mean, I've been teaching now for over 20 years, and I've seen a big change particularly in administrations. You talked about how they become so incredibly risk averse, I guess, or overprotective, I guess, helicopter administrations. And so the question, I guess, is, how this happened, because I remember, I went to college in the early 90s, and there was this whole PC wars thing. And so, these were issues, but it was in an atmosphere with, I felt like, a fairly robust support for free speech. And that's all of a sudden changed. And so the big question, I think, is, well, what happened here? How did we get to this point where free speech on college campuses? I mean, I've seen surveys for college students saying that they're perfectly okay with curtailing free speech, and that just stuns me. So what's going on here?
Yeah, I think we think there's a lot of factors at work here, and I think that we talk about 6 different factors for why we think we're seeing some of the problems today. That includes polarization, changes in parenting. Probably the most interesting one, I think, is lack of free play, which is a whole other topic we can get way into. But when it comes to free speech, I think that I think Hannah Arendt talks about, like, you could have absolutely the right idea, but if it's been around too long and a new generation, everything that you say that might be true about it just sounds like another cliche. It doesn't matter if it's correct. The new generation has to learn it themselves again, or just refuse to learn it again. And I think that in the highly polarized situation, particularly on campus, and by highly polarized, I mean that campuses, there's no question about it, lean decidedly to the left. And I think actually speech codes push people into even more politically homogeneous groups, because what speech codes don't really change people's minds, but they do tell them to talk to the people you already agree with.
Right.
And I think there was a lot of that sort of, group thinking and sort of pushing people back into these more ideologically tight spheres. And if you're kind of on one side where you don't have a lot of exposure to good or thoughtful people who disagree with you, and you see all these things caused by these people that you believe, are evil or regressive, it seems only natural that after a while you'd be like, what's this thing that's keeping me from shutting these people down? Oh, the First Amendment? I ran into this when I was working at the ACLU of Northern California in the late 90s, and this was like the people I would go to Burning Man with. Some of them, when they heard what I did, even back then, were kind of the first thing that came to mind was like, you're the person who opposes the hate speech codes that we think are good. And I'm like, that's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about freedom of speech? We must be doing a terrible PR job. I mean, like, this whole, Burning Man completely relies on the First Amendment. So I think there's a problem with isolation from other people who you have goodwill with, who you disagree with. If you're in a more politically homogeneous atmosphere, that also erodes belief in it. And I also think that the stage we are in First Amendment law and freedom of speech law does make things a little tougher. So, for example, like since the First Amendment law has been so well established, some of the cases they might have grown up with were cases like the, Animal Crush videos cases, where basically they're saying that, a law is banning the ability to tape, things that involve abuse of animals. That was ruled unconstitutional. It's largely misunderstood, though, because I'm very much in favor of that being protected, partially because how else are you going to know who's abusing animals?
Right.
And these are things that, in some cases, that will actually help shut down the ability for people to find out how this is happening. But certainly Citizens United, it was a very polarizing case. I don't blame anybody for being on the other side of that. They associate that with speech. That wasn't a great PR moment for people who disagree with, with the decision. But I do think a lot of it, and for that matter, some of the anti-bullying cases early on, and I think this is a generation that has a lot of sympathy, as I do, for the anti-bullying movement, but they see that some will be successful First Amendment challenges to bullying policy. Now, for me, of course, the irony is I've seen plenty of cases on at high schools where the anti-bullying policies end up being used to defend university principals or university teachers from quote-unquote being bullied by their students, which of course just was not the original intention of it. But I can see lots of natural forces that would lead people to be less protective of free speech. And most important, probably in front of them, is I think a lot of these students can't really think in a credible way that they will ever get in trouble for their own opinion on campus, and with that kind of idea that enlightened censorship is always going to be on your side, and that might actually be accurate, unfortunately, I think is going to lead to an erosion of faith in freedom of speech in a situation where it's only possible because people feel so secure that their free speech rights will be protected.
Yeah. So I know we're running a little short on time, but I'd like to end on hopefully a more positive note. Talk a little bit about solutions, which you look at in the last part of your book, the things we need to do to have wiser kids, wiser universities, and ultimately a wiser society. Now, on the podcast, we focus on politics and policy. So I was hoping maybe specifically you could talk a little bit about what you think government either can do or maybe sometimes, I guess, can stop doing that would contribute to these goals. Yeah, because,
At a governmental level, I think the Department of Education is already doing this to some degree, has to make harassment policies and recommendations clear. And what we saw going back to about 2013 was the Department of Education came up with a definition of harassment that was so broad and vague that if you could directly challenge it in court, it would not stand up for a minute. And so we've been advocating for just using the standards for harassment that are actually expounded by the Supreme Court. That's it. Just follow what the Supreme Court's actually saying. Give some clarity. And if there's clarity, you end up with fewer of these overreaction cases where university administrators or university presidents think that they have to punish professors. And by the way, a spate of these cases have all been women, oftentimes feminist professors, getting in trouble for saying things in class, which is not, the irony should not be lost in anybody, but as harassment because the standards are too vague. But thankfully, to a degree, that's happening. In terms of, it's one of these things like, since I'm a little leery about things being mandated, it limits me a little bit because for example, would love to see gap years become
Right.
an expectation, but I wouldn't want it to be the law. I'd like, and I think that when it comes to the lack of autonomy that I think this generation of particularly the kind of students who are going to some of these more elite colleges, a lot of cases they've been scheduled from 9 a.m. or 6 a.m. to bedtime. And this is not good for developing a sense of individuality, creativity, and particularly autonomy. And without a sense of locus of control, people tend to get depressed and anxious. So something that allows them to actually have some independence and possibly even go and live in another part of the country could really help with everything from maturity to polarization.
Yeah.
But in terms of what government can do, I'm always thinking about losing up the requirements for competitive models for the current version of higher education. Because for me, if you could develop a low-cost, high-rigor program that's very hardworking kids who would never dream of going to some of these $70,000 a year schools could actually use, that could tell me as an employer, because I'm also an employer as the head of a nonprofit, that these they've read tremendously, they have good writing skills, that doesn't have to cost this ridiculous amount of money. That those options become more possible as long as accreditation allows for some of these competing models. So I get excited about competing models. I think that some of the state governments have done a good job passing laws, for example, saying against speech zones. Saying that you can't tell students that they only get a 20-foot wide gazebo at a public college.
Right.
That's I think at this point something like eight states have passed these, freeing up the campuses to the horror of leafleters on every piece of lawn on campus, which also generally doesn't happen. We always explain it's like the world is not going to end if you allow students more free speech rights on campus. So there are a number of things that can be done, and I of course, and I'm just a typical First Amendment / con lawyer on this one. More civics.
Yeah, sure. No, I'm with you on that.
Civics education that would make me happy.
Yeah. Well, maybe, and you mentioned Cass Sunstein earlier, certainly he advocates governmental nudges to get people to move in that direction. So maybe things that nudge people toward experiencing different cultures, ideas, that sort of thing, that wouldn't necessarily be overly intrusive. So yeah.
Yep.
But I guess fundamentally, though, that the problem is that government is sort of downstream of this. When the culture sort of develops these attitudes, it can be difficult to sort of mandate changes without people changing their thinking, essentially.
Oh, I did actually just realize one thing that is really has a disproportionate impact on the way people raise their kids.
Okay.
Well, and you can pass laws to this effect. Stop arresting parents for letting their kids play in the park or take their bikes to school with their permission. And there's been a spate of these all over the country. And it only takes a handful of stories about parents, and some of them are incredibly sad. A mother went to work at the McDonald's. There's a park right across from the McDonald's. Her kid goes to play there, and the mother is arrested for, God forbid, letting her kid play in the park. And almost every single one of these cases, there are examples of things that we took for granted that we could do even from age of 6 on up. And so Utah even passed a free-range kids law saying, listen, like we're now guaranteeing that we're not going to be arresting people for giving their kids more freedom. So that's something that desperately needs to change, because even just like I said, just a handful of arrests for people letting their kids do relatively common things that we would have done as kids can really have a pervasive distorting effect on the way we parent.
So I guess there are some things that can be done, and that's good. And because I always like to close on at least as hopeful a note as I can, certainly. So on that hopeful note, we will close. Greg Lukianoff, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show is produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.